from life, spiritually from life experience.
Mm.
And, wisdom comes from life experience well digested, doesn't it? And
Life experience well digested.
Yeah.
So it's got to be more than just life experience.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So it doesn't mean, it means the older you are, it doesn't necessarily mean the more you know. There has to be the digested part. Well digested.
Well digested. Now, very often if that life experience is unpleasant in some aspect,
Yep.
our tendency is to project it out there. Someone is to blame, or some mythological creature, the devil, is to blame. But we project it out there instead of seeing it as a teaching, as something that we can process and learn from. Because I believe that spiritual growth comes through the tension of opposite states.
This is really interesting, and we should probably announce that. I'm looking at Jason. I think we're just going live now, so we are live with Joy Cowley. Thank you so much for coming in. I'm absolutely honoured, excited, as is every person I speak to, my children included, that we get to speak to you today in our humble little podcast. So thanks for coming in.
Oh, Pat, look, I'm as ordinary as tap water. And
Well,
please, I protect my ordinariness.
I think most people would disagree with that statement, but I understand what you're saying.
Yeah.
Because ordinary as tap water people wouldn't be bringing out anthologies like this one, for example, which is what, your latest book, the latest anthology.
Yeah,
there's stories.
It came out last weekend. Yeah,
and there's stories from previous stories you've written, reimagined, re-illustrated by Giselle Clarkson.
That's right. Beautiful illustrations.
And it is, we were just saying, I won't embarrass myself by reading it out now. This illustration really spoke to me. I don't know why, but about Uncle Andy's. You see that in the frame there, Jace? Is that good enough?
It's good.
Yeah? Uncle Andy's singlet, an example of the drawings that are in there, the illustrations that are in there.
But when you look at that, Pat, you will see that it's the illustrations that bring the words alive. That they really do.
Really think so? That's interesting, especially coming from the author to say that.
Two authors. I think the illustrator almost always is the co-author. And what an illustrator does to my words is breathe life into them.
We had an expert on yesterday talking about Shakespeare, Dr. William Germano, who's come to Dunedin from New York to deliver a lecture about Shakespeare in the operatic form. And he said something similar, because you think about Shakespeare, you think about the written word, but he's basically saying it's the actor's job to actually bring life to those words.
That's true.
So it's
that's true.
Yeah, it's the combination of the two for the whole product.
So you would say that the actors are co-authors.
Yeah. If you were using that analogy.
Well, that's so. Certainly, it's very clear in children's picture books that the children get the excitement from the illustrations, and that directs them to the words.
It's also a very humble thing to say, because I'm not suggesting you, Joy, but there might be some authors out there that think when their name is typically in bigger font on the front, that makes them more important. But yours almost sounds like you're saying the opposite, because if the kids are drawn into the colours and the pictures,
to the illustrations.
So what happens as books get? I mean, straight away, just because it's massive, I'm thinking about Harry Potter. Very few illustrations, but still has so really fully reliant on the words. Kids are a bit older who typically read those. How does that journey work for those for those imagining, to look and feel about a YA fiction as opposed to a young child's book?
Yes, because that's for young children. And it has visual impact. Now, there's a different kind of visual impact in Harry Potter books. Have you noticed that the writing is very visual?
Yeah.
And she has this knack of putting you right in the situation, and it's magic, but she also explains the magic to make it digestible.
And I think one of the most amazing things about the visual aspect of Harry Potter is that J.K. Rowling got to be the person telling she was involved with the films. So she had the picture in her head. She wrote about it, but then she literally got to put it on screen, because she was like, this is what Hogwarts looks like. and it wasn't someone else's interpretation of her words. It was actually her telling the set designers what the place should look like.
That was so important, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think so.
Because very often a creative person writes a script and puts her own story into it.
Yeah.
And because J.K. Rowling did that herself, the films were true to the books. Yeah.
Yeah, I think very much so. Maybe more so than any other, especially the YA area, books to movie adaptations.
Yeah.
Have much of your writing been turned into film, after school programs, short stories?
No.
Just because it's not something you've been interested in, or just the opportunity hasn't turned up?
Well, I don't do that. A couple of books have been made into films. My first adult novel was made into a film. Roald Dahl bought the film rights for his wife Pat Neal, who had had several strokes, and he wished to help with her rehabilitation. And my first novel, which was actually a very quiet and gentle love story called Nest in a Falling Tree, published in the 1960s, he bought the film rights and wrote a script turning it into a murder mystery.
Oh, right.
Well, actually more of a horror story.
So it changed from a soft and gentle love story to Saw, Saw movie series.
Well, it was a story about a young necrophiliac, actually. It was he really went the whole hog on it. But I really didn't mind. It wasn't a good movie, but he did pay a lot of money for it, and that bought the property in the Marlborough Sounds.
Oh, very good. So there's certainly an upstream literally effect for that for the movies.
Yeah, there was. Yeah.
Now you are a prolific. Would it be fair to acknowledge you're a prolific writer? The number of stories you have published in excess of 1,000. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, there are a lot of early reading books because I've been very concerned with children who had, my experience actually when I was young, I was a late reader. Because the reading system didn't suit me.
Right.
I was an imaginative child. I was very visual, and I had to learn letters and then two letters together and then short words and then longer words. There was no meaning, and it's important that children read for meaning.
Right.
So when my own son was having a little problems reading, his teacher intervened and said, "Why don't you write for him?" Which I did. She held up the book he was supposed to be reading and said, "There is no reason why any child should be interested in this book."
What a great teacher.
Yeah, she was a great teacher.
That's awesome.
So I wrote for him, for other children. I actually did story talk with them. I asked them questions about, if you could have any birthday party you like, what would it be like? Got some fantastic ideas, and I'd write that down. Write in the third person their name in it, and they would take that home and their parents would read it to them. And then I would have a carbon paper in those days, typewriter.
Yeah.
And then would make a little book of the story and just do little drawings in it as illustration. No child was ever reluctant to read their own story.
That's interesting. I remember, I actually have seen recently, speaking to that, there are opportunities to purchase books off the internet and they print it for you with your child's name in it. So it seems to be a business now, whereas for you it just sounded like a bloody good idea.
Well, yes, it was just making a little hand printed written book of the child's story.
So when you started writing for your son, was that sort of your first foray into children's writing? Is that literally you started kids' books for your own son and it went from there?
Well, before that I used to write for my children and had stories published in the school journals.
Right.
But I had 3 children who read before they started school. He was the one who was a very practical little boy, and I was too young to know that children had different ways of learning.
Sure.
And he was an auditory learner.
Right.
And he still doesn't read fiction. He's now 60, and he, for entertainment, he picks up an encyclopedia at a Christmas party and reads it all out to us. And we sit there as feeling very bored while Edward reads us information. That's what he does. He reads for information.
That's interesting. I remember when I was in primary school and intermediate, my biggest complaint from my teachers was reads too much non-fiction, needs to read more fiction. And
right.
I've gone the other. Well, I haven't gone the other way now. I don't read much fiction, but
Well,
I'm now a
no, but
filmmaker,
I see that in you now, Jace. Like Jason's the technical guru, and if we have a problem, it's the internet version of it. He goes online and finds the answer, but it's the internet version of it. He gets out all the technical books to find the answer to the problem. So I think that served us quite well, actually, Jason. Thanks for that. Appreciate that.
Absolutely.
Wouldn't be here without it.
And the family, our Edward, the family rely on him. They call him Mr. Fix-It.
Perfect, see? Different way of learning, different source of information, and for use in a different way.
And he did an apprenticeship in aeronautical mechanical engineering.
So you're writing for your son. You're writing. I remember those journals. They still use journals today, don't they? And you've got little Lees at school. Journals are still happening today?
So my daughter's in year 1, so she's learning to read properly. So she gets books, and they have levels. So they go level 1, and they have just different. That level 1 book might not have any words that are bigger than 4 letters, sort of thing. And then it's all very, very light. It's maybe only 4-word sentences. It's just
right.
And
for
then
me,
they go up. Yeah.
It's such a vivid memory. If I close my eyes, I can still picture myself walking through the part. It must have been a resource room, like as a 8-year-old, and getting those cardboard boxes with the angled lines on them that all the journals sat in.
Journals stacked in them.
And pulling them out and getting the right one and taking it back to the classroom. It's a incredibly vivid memory. So it goes to show how ingrained that is in New Zealand culture for reading. Your books, obviously, and your work is all over the world. How do we stack up with our reading, our understanding, our kids compared to the rest of the world?
Well, I think our reading standards are very high compared with the rest of the Western world.
Right.
Now, I say the Western world because I've worked a bit in Singapore, Hong Kong, and the children there start reading when they're 3 years old.
Right.
Yeah, they come in very early, and they learn by rote. So there's a different way of learning. The children are very bright.
Yep.
The first time I talked to young children in a school in Singapore, they bussed children in from other schools. So there was this huge, huge hall, open at the sides, but it was steaming hot. I had a fan. The children were in uniforms, and these little children were sitting cross-legged with their arms folded, 5 and 6 year olds.
Yeah.
And all of the teachers, I could see see them at the back. Now, that wouldn't happen in New Zealand school. Teachers would be with the children.
Right.
But those children sat like that for an hour. When I was about to start, the principal of the school said, you will talk for an hour. And I said, oh, no, 20 minutes is long enough for this age group. And he said, the buses will come back in 1 hour.
Yeah, okay.
So I talked for an hour, or just on an hour, and they asked very sensible questions after that. I was amazed. I hadn't seen that. But that became usual in those schools.
Singapore, I think, is listed as the country with the highest IQ in the world on average. So it kind of makes sense. I think
probably.
So. You could probably Google that for us, Jace. I say things and I think, I wonder if that's rubbish or not. There you go, the 10 most educated nations in the world.
So I think it's so looking at according to this website in particular, it says that we are 7th in the world for literacy rates. Behind Russia, 10. Canada, Japan, Israel, USA, South Korea.
Japan is good too.
Yeah. Does that feel right to you? It says the number 1 country for literacy in the world is Russia, or is that just because Putin says everyone can read? And
I think it's because it's also to do with their. But according to this, it says that their literacy rates are good because 53% of their population has a tertiary education.
There is a great emphasis on reading in Russia.
Yeah.
Now, I was there pre-Glasnost, so it was there were lots of elements in early education, which I really admired under communist rule. For example, there was no violence allowed in movies that children saw.
Right. Okay.
I mean, our children's movies are just full of violence. And the importance of reading in the home was so much better than ours. Here, people will sometimes read to their children, and it's usually the mothers, because the dads are busy, they're working. their parents, both parents, read to their children, or did when I was there.
Yeah.
And that seemed to be universal. And it was like the music that they have in stores. You know, we have this, what do you call it? When that boxed music they play in
Music, like
big
elevator
stores.
music.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was always classical music.
Right.
They were educated on classical music too. So there was so much gentle emphasis on education and taking those early years where children are sponges to give them the right kind of information that's going to help them later on.
You sound like you have some concerns for potentially where society is today, where children are today compared to maybe trends and the way we did things in the past, so to speak. Am I feeling that correctly? Is that something that you are a bit concerned about?
Yes, I am. I'm concerned at the lack of social interaction in young children. It's done through phones. I sometimes wonder about the loneliness of that. Children don't come home from school and then play and go into games with each other. And I have to be careful about, this is an opinion coming from someone who didn't have that, because I know that my parents thought that the radio would
Be the
actually,
death of us.
Yeah, it would absolutely ruin family life because people wouldn't talk to each other after their meal.
It seems every generation has the same concerns about the following generation. I mean, you know, my parents being concerned about, I guess when I was growing up in the 80s, there was an influx of, you know, it's where the VCR came out, so a version of on-demand input and the music I was listening to, whereas their parents were probably worried about Elvis and the music they were listening to. And like you say, I guess there's going to get to a point where actually the concerns of the parent become more valid. Like, so obviously Elvis didn't really do anything to harm that generation. Maybe the music I listened to didn't do anything, but at some stage, like I listened to some of the words that come out on the songs that my 10-year-old has on Spotify now, and I kind of go, crumbs, I don't really want that in my house. Let's delete that one from the playlist, thanks, little one. And she does. But yeah. So put that one up, Jace, about the phones and the newspapers.
Oh, it's just a classic, you know. For those listening at home, it's just a picture of the 1950s, and everybody's with a graphic over the top saying, you know, I hate it when everybody stares at their phone when they're on the train, and it's a bunch of people reading the newspaper. So
saying that we all stare at our phones, but in the 19, what would that be, 40s, 50s?
Yeah.
They all stared at their newspapers.
Where was that?
I hate it when everybody just stares at their phones.
Was that in England?
Possibly, I think it probably everywhere. But I was just there's
here?
another thing I saw. I just saw about this the other day. It's a campaign. I think it's particularly in the US. I'll just bring it up. There we go. Where it's basically a campaign. They're saying wait until 8th, which is a campaign, which is kind of a bit ridiculous.
Eighth
It
grade?
needs to be. So I think it's 8th grade. It might mean 8
So
years
that's
old,
Form
but
3, that's
yeah,
year 9, because Americans go K through 12.
So they're saying that you should wait till 8th grade to give your children a smartphone, so that exactly as you're saying, you know, they can learn to socialise.
Well, that's the first. So in America, that would be the equivalent of year 9 in New Zealand, which is the equivalent of the first year of secondary school.
So
I
see preschoolers with their parents' phones going.
There's sometimes, for me, there's a bit of a difference sometimes letting a kid have a bit of a tutu. Yeah. Whereas I've got a daughter in year 5, so that's second to last year of primary school. She's got friends with phones, and I'm like, what the hell? You know, it's like, to me, that's too young. Whereas I think maybe secondary school is about the age in this day and age that they get them. I don't know if when I was growing up, what technology computers, etc., were coming in through my teenage years. But yeah, but it's different. I used to do some work with Ian Grant, who I'm sure you know of, and it used to be, you know, have your family computer in the lounge, because then when the kids are working on it, the parents can kind of keep an eye on what's going on. But now this thing is, they say things like this is more powerful than the first ships that went into space.
Yeah, well,
That's
basically
right.
like you almost your white one, not including Apple Watches, but even just almost a calculator these days has got more computing power because
So
they
now
didn't have microchips.
I've got a computer in my pocket all the time. That is, so in other words, that whole have your computer in the lounge doesn't work because kids have got computers in their pockets. And I think you have to be a bit of an ogre as a parent these days. I tell my kids that their friends will hate me because I don't do things. I don't let my kids charge their phones in their room. I've got 2 who are at high school, so they've got phones. They charge them out in the lounge area. My eldest daughter has a laptop. I'm like, you charge it out in the lounge area. They're not allowed in their bedroom. Oh, but Dad, it's my alarm. So I bought them alarm clocks. The reason I say your friends are going to hate me is their friends come around and I'm like, yeah, you guys leave your phones out as well. There's no phones in bedrooms in this house. But actually, it's not that difficult to do. It's not that difficult as a parent or a caregiver or a person in authority to actually go, this is the line and this is how we run in this house. I don't know why parents seem to be too concerned about doing that. Maybe some parents want to be more friends than parents. That's a bit of a judgy thing to say, but
It's interesting though, and the flip side of that, though, in our house is that my daughter that I was just talking about that's learned to read, a component. We read to her from day one. Every night before bed, she gets a bedtime story, and they get older and can ask for more. It becomes bedtime stories, plural. But she has, when she gave up having her nap, she started having a quiet time in her bedroom, and so we gave her. When she got old enough to, she actually had one of our iPads, which was locked to a particular reading app, and it was this little game that she could play where she had to collect letters and build words. And because of that, I think that actually gave her. She could do most of the alphabet and do some basic reading before she started primary school, and I think part of that was because she was engaged with the iPad, and so. It's one of those catch-22s. It's like it's actually a really helpful device, but you need to be very, very strategic as a parent when you're using them.
It's amoral, isn't it? I mean, that's what it's. Technology is amoral. It's neither good nor bad. It's how we use it. I mean, kids can be on their smartphones all the time, and it can ruin their brains. Or like Jason just said, I guess little E's can be using them for educational games, and it might help their reading.
Yeah. Well, I was a reader. Well, once I learned to read, I became addicted to reading, and I can remember my Scottish grandmother saying to me, "Too much reading, it'll make you soft in the head." She was probably right, but so she was worried about the amount of reading that I used to do. I suppose every generation does have concerns about the younger generation. But I think, where is the physical contact? Where is the physical interaction?
I have, and you're right, because, I also have seen in my house 4 teenage girls sitting there on the couches, all of them on their phones.
Yes.
And I've walked in and I've actually, it's because I'm an ogre, I've actually walked into that lounge setting and gone, okay, you guys might as well go home now. And they've looked at me and I've gone, well, you could be doing this from your own home. You could be playing on the phone in your own home. Oh no, but we want to do it together, but you're not interacting. So it's just I do think that in society in general at the moment, and not at the moment, always, people have kind of thrown up their hands too easily and gone, oh, what can we do about it? Oh, like in the classic, I remember when I worked as a talkback host, people used to complain about not being able to buy a house because houses are so expensive. And I would always say to people, there's always a choice. So you live in central Auckland, you can't afford to buy a house, fair enough. Do you want to move to Matamata, where you can afford to buy a house? No? Okay, but just be aware, it's not that you can't buy a house, it's that you're making a choice to stay in position A, and that the people are like, well, we can't move. And I go, okay, well, that's fine, but there's always choices, but people tend to throw their hands up in the air and say, can't do anything about this. I think 99% of the time we can do something about most things, but we may just choose not to.
I agree with that, yeah. But I do worry about the suicide rate in New Zealand.
Yeah.
And is there a connection there with loneliness, with negative news, for example? I used to have I don't know what I'd call it. We went out to schools, but it was a little program about helping children to understand that when they watch television, they are watching what someone wants them to see.
Yeah.
And if we look at our news and check. These children used to check what was positive, what was neutral, and what was negative. And largely negative, the news.
Yeah, of course. If it bleeds, it leads, they say.
It's part of that bullfight mentality we have. I mean, we even have to make our weather forecast sound like grand opera. So how is that affecting the children? Because we think it's good for them to see the news, and they sit there and they're absorbing all of this threatening stuff.
Well, and especially now in this day and age where the news is not just 6 p.m. TV1, sit down and watch it with the whānau. It is, again, CNN sending what Donald Trump's up to straight to my phone.
That's right.
It is, a news item popping up from Stuff linked to a video on YouTube so it's immediate as well. Should something big happen, probably the first place to go to find out about it is Twitter, because someone is there on the street watching it, tweeting about what's going on. And then it disseminates through actual journalists to get the.
And how much of that is positive? Because I don't do Twitter. None.
Yeah, none. I mean, how much of Twitter is positive? Not none. No, there's plenty of positive things on Twitter, but it's a bit shocking actually. If you look in Facebook, especially, there are algorithms written to drive content to you that you interact with. But what they've found is people typically interact more with things they hate than things they love. So therefore, people within some social medias, I know it happens on Facebook, I don't know about the others, the algorithm set up behind them as to what they're going to see is more often linked towards stuff they're going to disagree with than agree with, because when you disagree, you complain. It's like when you're at a restaurant, if it's the worst food in the world, you go, oh, this is terrible, and you make a complaint. If it's the best food in the world, you're more likely just to walk out and think that was lovely, but you don't.
Yeah,
it's not the equivalent.
Yeah, that's actually 100%. I worked in retail and got retail training when I was a student, and they actually literally say that. They say that if a person has a bad experience, they will tell 10 people. If they have a good experience, they might tell 2.
Yeah,
and so that's why you've got to be. Yeah. That's why you've got to be really good at resolving conflicts with customers.
So how do you get around all this negative input on children? Then what do you do?
Well, first of all, to make sure that they don't see this is what the world is. It's what someone wants you to see.
I remember someone once saying at the end of every news bulletin, it might have been an American comedian, they should say, so that's how 12 people spent the day today. The other 320 million had a lovely day.
Yeah. And I think we should take a step back and just look at how does this affect children, especially teenagers who are full of hormones and are great one day and depressed the next day. What's going to tip them over?
Well, and also, I mean, I've been talking to my daughters about this recently, then to think about where they are in their growing up. The idea of the frontal lobe being so important to consequences, and that not being fully developed in blokes until the mid-20s, and in females more like early 20s, and so decisions and stuff that teenagers are making when they're 16, 17, thinking the world is ending or whatever, give it a few years and wait till you're fully developed, and then let's readdress that.
Yes. Well, I think during World War II, I used to hear adults saying that the world was going to come to an end. And that's always been a prediction in fundamentalist churches. They've always known that the end is coming. And they'll find texts to prove that. So there is this, something is feeding the negative in people. And it's probably news. I mean, I have friends who don't watch news now, and they avoid it.
When you started this part of the conversation, you referenced suicide figures. I wonder, Jace, suicide figures today, with this massive exposure to negative news, versus, say, suicide stats in the 80s, where you didn't have the 24-hour news cycle, you didn't have, negative news come into your phone in your pocket. Are they similar, or are they? Well, there's some stats.
Yeah, so this is on the stats website, and they've
Try
stopped.
going back before the 1980s.
Yeah. That's the thing is that they don't seem to have much more data, but it
about the
seems
1950s.
Oh, is that the age range?
That's
of
the age
people?
ranges.
Okay.
Yeah. So this is like 1996.
Goes to the 90s, which is the internet age.
Yeah.
Yes,
But the suicides, I mean, as the blue line's male is dropping down.
It sort of looks like, it doesn't look like it's greatly improving or decreasing or getting better or worse according to these stats, but at the same time this ends in 2013.
Yeah.
And so, this is only really, Facebook was about here 2009, 2010.
Yeah,
so
yeah,
we
yeah,
won't have seen the repercussions in this data. There could all of a sudden be a spike in the data.
And also...
And unfortunately they're no longer...
And also kids who are 10 when Facebook come out, their stats, quote unquote stats, may not be prevalent for another 10 years.
Yeah, you're not going to see it. That's the trouble with these sorts of things, is that the ramifications take years to show up in the data, and by that stage it's too hard to correct.
And if the dark blue, I'm looking at this graph, if the dark blue is the total, it seems to be hovering between about 15 and 10. So that seems pretty stagnant through that 15 to 18 year cycle. Yeah. But I mean, in New Zealand as well, we're terrible. I mean, when I say we're terrible, we have terrible statistics around suicide. And you think about, it's interesting, I mean, what causes that, what brings happiness? And you look at stats around people with money, for example, and you think, I've got a jet ski. How can I be unhappy? But people with money, they have the same suicide rates as people without money. So what is it? What does society need? What do our children need to find that genuine happiness to drive them away from, issues like suicide, which would be, I guess, the extreme. But even coming back from that, you mentioned depression before, or isolation, or...
Isolation is a big thing, I think. In 1978, I backpacked around South America for 2.5 months. And I was in countries, because I was doing it on a shoestring, I travelled on the trucks with the campesinos, and I thought, these people have no right to be so happy. Why are they so happy? They were. And the average expectancy of life then in Bolivia was 45 for women and 43 for men.
Wow.
Well, that's not a life as far as we're concerned.
Certainly nothing to be happy about.
And I soon learned that if I wanted to buy something in a shop, I didn't go in and ask for it. That would be very rude. I would ask the man how he was, how was his wife, how were his children. We'd have this conversation. And then I would get my purchase, and behind me there'd be a long line of people waiting, and they'd be talking, and I actually picked up some good recipes and had good conversations and waiting in those lines. But people had time for each other.
It's really interesting, because I'm feeling a little bit guilted by what you just said, because I stand at New World behind someone who's having a conversation with the cashier, and I go, just hurry up. Come on. I've got places to be. But I mean, I think about the kind of Spanish culture of siestas and, having a break and a chill out and a rest in the afternoon. And it makes me think there's some kind of parallel to what you're talking about. It's just taking time. It's talking. It's spending time with people.
And apparently suicide rates are very low. They're very unusual.
Do you think that's a key marker for how a country's doing, suicide rates? Do you think that's like if you're going to pull out some key markers, that's one of the ones that if it's high, look out, there's trouble in that country?
It's an affluent, a symptom of affluence, suicide, because it is in Japan too. And they are very concerned about the suicide rate of young people who are driven, have got expectations placed on them. Academically
a lot as well, isn't there? I've heard lots of stories about in Japan, if a child or a student doesn't reach a place where they're expected to be, that can be enough to tip them over.
Yes, it can.
That's
interesting.
terrifying.
I've just found out.
So what makes them feel worthless?
Would that be not living up to the standards expected of them? And that one example? That's
one factor. Feeling alone in this, not having family support, and generally not having a system around you of human support and comfort. Lacking in friends.
Yeah, it's interesting because I'm just reflecting on the friends. My daughters, they chat away on their phones to their friends, and on one level, I kind of go, well, they're connecting with. They know these people in real life, so they're their friends from school. It's not like they're just strangers on the internet. But another level, I kind of go, well, is that worse than picking up the phone and talking to them? Is picking up the phone and talking to them worse than, when I say worse, I mean not as effective in building relationship as walking down the road and sitting at the bus stop and meeting your mate there and chatting? Yeah, I'm not sure. But isolation would be a horrible thing. I mean, I guess that's why people who are in places like solitary confinement, get psychological issues. That would be the, I guess, most severe form of isolation, being forced into isolation when you don't want it. Psychological issues that come along with that. Why things like the World Health Organization have rules around how long you're allowed to leave someone in solitary confinement, because obviously it's recognized that that's an unhealthy place to be.
It also happens with animals too. People think it might be nice to have one parrot as a pet, and the poor parrot goes mad.
Dogs as well. Dogs are pack animals. Having one dog,
Yep.
or not allowing them to have their pack. Yeah, gosh. You have another, obviously, an interest. In fact, maybe you could retell the story we had in the car about your qualifications, and you found a faith, a spirituality in the 80s.
Yeah.
Tell us about that.
Well, I've always had that feeling of otherness, a feeling of presence, of otherness. I used to make
Meaning something more than what we can see and feel?
Something more than me. That sometimes warned me about something, and I'd look up and there'd be a car coming.
Yep. Right.
Or that suggested a better way of doing something. It was a quiet and positive influence. And I made up this story about having a twin sister who died when we were born, and she was in heaven and she was telling me things.
Right.
That was a small child's understanding of it.
Sure.
I'd always, my parents had a fundamentalist faith. It was pretty narrow, and I didn't take that on because it was rather negative.
So we just pause for a sec. When you say fundamentalist faith,
well,
just so people who don't quite understand what that means.
Well, yes. Well, they believed that the Bible was dictated by God.
So if for people who don't understand maybe the context within a Christian faith, I mean, within media, you talk about, and I'm not saying that your parents were like this, but when you see people like the Brian Tamakis of the world, or people refer to them as the happy clappy Christians, or that kind of group of people, are considered fundamentalists. They believe fundamentally that like the Bible is literally...
The Bible is literally 100% true.
Cool. So just to context that for some people.
Yeah. And there's no argument, because they will defend that vigorously, because they were in a very small space themselves, and they hold on to that.
Yeah.
But I was a child who asked questions.
Yeah.
So
you were trouble.
Yes, I guess. I can remember once saying to my mother, well, why did God knew everything. Yeah, so why did God make Adam and Eve so that they were frail and they would be disobedient? Why did he make them like that?
Why did he make them to fail?
Yeah. Of course, now the answer is we grow spiritually. I believe this is life school,
right,
and that we grow spiritually through the tension of opposite states. I find the Adam and Eve story quite interesting, because it was written at the time of the Babylonian exile, It wasn't the first book written.
Mm-hmm.
And these poor Jews have been taken out of their promised land, their Garden of Eden. Whether they believed God dwelled in the temple, well, that had been destroyed. And there they were, threatened with extinction. And that's when they wrote the story of the Garden of Eden. They believed that they had done something terrible to deserve this, because in Judaism in those days, every little bit of misfortune came from the sin, either of theirs or their parents.
Right.
So that was the subcontext of that story, but there's some wisdom in it. The fruit of the knowledge of good and evil on that tree, they ate the forbidden fruit. Well, it wasn't two trees, it wasn't two fruits, it was a knowledge of good and evil was contained in one fruit, and if you ate that fruit, you acquired wisdom.
Yeah. So you knew. You didn't need to rely on this omnipotent being to pass on information. You had the information.
Yeah. That's what it was about.
Yeah. So on some levels, you were godlike, or you didn't need a god because you had the information you needed.
So that was that's a great parable for spiritual growth. That if we were perfect, there'd be no growth.
True.
Perfect means being complete.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, analogies of that is you look at people who, for example, are great athletes. They're at perfection. They've got all the skills they need. No need for growth. You look at someone who's out of shape and overweight and stuff. They have an opportunity to improve their place to get to perfection.
Yeah.
Perfection in quotes.
Yeah.
Perfection.
Right. But I believe that spiritually, and by spiritually I mean our perception of ourselves and the world all around us, that never ends until our death. We just keep on growing.
Right.
And that's what we're here for.
To grow?
Well, I would say, if you're going to ask me what I believe, I would say I believe that we come from a greater reality and we return to that greater reality, and our little time here in life school is for spiritual growth.
Right.
Now, that greater reality, I wouldn't put a name on it. The word G-O-D is useful, but it's presence. And the more you grow spiritually, the more you're aware that it's managing your life for you. It's all around you. It's in everything. And the most difficult thing that we can do is to sit on the road and worship the maps.
Explain that.
Yeah. Well, for me, growing up, the map was the Bible.
Right.
And I had to journey a lot further than that. So in my 30s, I was looking at other religions and finding that at a mystical level, all of the religions in the world come out with light and love. And we're very confident about what we know. We say the world is this, the universe is that. What we should say is we perceive it to be this, or we perceive it to be that. Because all we can know is what is relayed through our five senses. And we don't have good sensory systems compared with some animals.
Yeah, it's true.
You look at a flock of birds flying, and they wheel around like tea leaves in a drain. They never collide.
Right.
They must have a consciousness that holds them all in formation. Try doing it with the same number of planes and see what you got.
Or just people running around a rugby field. Like imagine trying to get them all to move at the same time.
Yep. So we don't have a greatly developed sensory system.
Right.
And if we didn't have that, for example, if we left our bodies behind and moved on, the greater reality might just be pure light. And the universe might be just pure light. How much of the universe do we really know, and how much is sensory experience? And a man said to me, yes, but these days we have all of this technology which tells us what the universe is, what the universe is. And I said, yeah, but how do we read this technology? With the same five senses.
So it seems that we know what we know, almost what we can experience, what we can see, taste, etc., etc., etc. When you're talking about, I mean, you're a spiritual director. It means you direct people spiritually and help them along. How do we then step into what that spiritual is? How do we trust what it is if we can only really trust our senses?
Well, I believe that we are spiritual beings on a human journey, not the other way around.
I know when you said that before, not to interrupt you, I thought about boarding school. It's like we've come from somewhere, we're in an education, journey, and we go back to somewhere. I thought, I went to boarding school. Well, it feels like boarding school. So we leave home, we go to boarding school, and then we end up going back home again.
Yeah. Well, growth is the imperative of the universe as far as we know. Growth is the imperative of this planet too. Everything is in a state of growth or else in a state of decay to grow into something new. Well, I think we are meant to grow too. And why I say I think that we are spiritual beings on a human journey, there is some evidence that we come from somewhere else.
What evidence do you cite for that?
We're working with children.
Okay, explain that. Expand for me. Evidence that we come from somewhere else.
Young children seem to have a memory of something.
Yeah.
Now, the children, when I wanted to do research for 5-year-olds, I don't talk to 5-year-olds. They're not reflective. I go to 8-year-olds and say, when you were 5 or when you were 4, what were your favourite things? What were you scared of? And what did you like? And so I'd get information that way. And children will talk about their dreams. And they have commonly dreams of being somewhere very, very nice, which is... and one girl used the word sunshiny, a sunshiny place, and then it all turned nasty, and it all broke up. Now that's like a birthing dream,
right?
Psychologists acknowledged that that we had this sense of otherness when we were quite young, and they said that. Really, it was the time in the womb. Well, nowadays they can put electrodes on babies in the womb. They can check babies in the womb quite accurately. And the time in the womb is quite stressful. Babies can feel uncomfortable with what the parent has eaten or the noise that's around. Mm-hmm. And they can feel cramped. So it can be a stressful time. So... where does the notion of perfection come from? If I asked you to describe an extra colour in the rainbow, you wouldn't be able to do it.
No.
How can you describe perfection when nothing in this world is perfect? Everything in a state of becoming. And to attribute that to the time in the womb is not valid.
So you're suggesting that the feelings of being in a happy place, paraphrasing, is pre-womb. Everyone
is aspiring for perfection. Mm-hmm. That's something that's within us. Where does it come from? What do you think?
Where does the aspirations of perfection come from? I'm a very lazy, non-focused man, so I might be the wrong person to ask that question. No, okay. So if let me contextualize that for myself. Where does it come from? For me, for example, it comes from a desire to want to succeed, a desire to want to be able to see what I'm doing be valid and valued and worthwhile. Why do I want it to succeed and be valid? I don't know. I think I want to what I'm thinking of right now, because it's my current focus, is actually this podcast. Not you and me, but what I'm trying to do here with this podcast. Why do I want to see this be successful? I think this is going to sound really horribly arrogant, but I think this adds a positive aspect to society. I think this brings something into this realm of media that's not here at the moment. I enjoy what I'm doing as well. I love this. I want to do this for the next 10 years full time if I could. So there's an enjoyment factor, and I know that if I reach perfection in what I'm doing here, that means I will have the ability to do more of it, because perfection in this would mean enough people listening and watching to be able to then monetize it, to be able to then live off it, to be able to then do it more. So feelings of a desire to be able to do more of these because I love them so much is one of the reasons I wanted to get to a point of perfection.
Good, Pat. That's good.
Is that working at all?
You've just described how it works.
Yeah.
But you haven't described why.
Why it works?
Why do you have this desire? It's because it's in all of us. It is. When people lose themselves, they lose that spark of light, of desire that's in them. And that's when people decide they're not worth it. They have no worth. So that's the problem with people who suicide.
They don't have that spark. That spark is diminished.
Now, in Judaism, they believe that you can only talk about spiritual matters in parable, and so do I.
Okay. So in parable only, not in a literal sense.
Not in a literal sense.
Okay.
Because they say the head has words, the heart has no words, and this
Right.
belongs to the heart.
Okay.
So one of the parables that's very meaningful for them is a creation parable. And they say, in the beginning, God created this huge clay vessel, and God blew the fire of love into this vessel. And God's love was so strong that the vessel shattered into trillions of pieces, and creation was born. So each of us is a shard of clay with a spark of God in it. And it's our duty on this life to fan that spark into a flame. So that's another way of describing what you just described to me.
Yeah. Sparking something little.
There's a
into
drive
something.
in us.
Yes. Yeah. And it's also interesting. I wonder as well about that. I have a drive in me personally for some areas of life, and other areas of life I'm like,
That's right.
don't really care about that.
Yeah.
And I wonder if that comes down to our individual spark. Like it's not a societal spark. Everyone, I mean, Jace is a filmmaker. I'm sure if you asked me about his spark, it would be sitting at the Oscars, Jace? Would that be the ultimate end of your spark?
It would be the point at which I realise that I haven't wasted the rest of my life, but wouldn't necessarily. It's not the ultimate goal once, because once I get an Oscar, I'm not going to quit.
Yeah, sure, okay,
You know, that sort of thing. But yeah, I know what you mean. Like,
I mean, I have no ambition. That's not a spark in me.
yeah, you have no idea. You if you got an Oscar, you'd be like, how did this happen?
It's like Kobe Bryant. That's how Kobe Bryant got his Oscar.
You, but it's the whole like what is the point of an Oscar?
I feel like
It's
we're in a spiritual direction meeting right now.
It's an inner light that is, and it's connected with love.
Yep.
It's there. And I believe it's in every healthy person. I think when people feel worthless, they lose sight of it. They've got a lot of negative stuff hiding it.
Right. So hiding it but not disappear. So the
It doesn't
spark's still
disappear.
there.
No, it's still there.
Right.
And it just goes back, and I think it gets recycled.
So of course it leads me on to your spark. You have multiple sparks. I mean, this here, again, this is just an example of your latest work. This is a spark that you've been fanning for how many decades?
Oh, don't know.
2, 3,
I
12.
used to tell my sister's stories every night.
Yeah.
It was our way of remaking our childhood, I think.
And have you reached perfection in this spark, the spark that is your writing?
I wouldn't use the word perfection, because some of my writing gives me pleasure,
Yeah.
and some of it bores me.
Yeah.
That the things in there give me some kind of pleasure,
Yep.
and they are mostly funny. That's why I like writing for children, because it's funny. And it's never too late to go back and enjoy your childhood, is it?
No. Do you feel this keeps you young?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah.
How often do you get out and mix with kids in your books? Like I'm thinking about, do you get into schools and do you read to them from your own books?
I don't visit schools now because that just got too huge.
Right.
But last weekend, the publishers wanted to have a launching. Actually, they wanted it in Wellington.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, well, look, why not come up to Featherston and let's have a children's party?
Oh, cool.
Which we did. We had about 500 people in the hall, and about half of those were children. And the Lionesses in Featherston put on a children's afternoon tea with little triangular sandwiches with hundreds and thousands, Cheerios with tomato sauce, all the things
Sounds
that
great.
kids like.
Yeah.
And it was just a wonderful afternoon. It really, really was.
And that was the official launch of the book.
It was official launch.
And that's great. That feels a bit Kiwi as well, like to have that kind of launch as opposed to being in a Barnes and Noble in the middle of yeah.
And there was a young man who helped me. He had, because my sight's so poor, he had post-it notes and he handed it round. He's 9 years old, and usually when people phone me or knock on the door, they want something. But there was this knock on the door 2 months ago, and this 9-year-old boy, he was a neighbour's boy, said, "Joy, you're old and I want to help you."
How delightful.
Isn't that wonderful?
Yeah.
And I get him to pick up the cabbage tree leaves on the lawn to get them out of the way of the mower.
Yeah, they don't do well with the mower.
No,
I have
they
the same
don't.
experience.
They don't. Yeah. So he helped me with the launch, quite seriously. And actually, he was on television on Saturday night, TV1, and there was a shot of him, and his dad and his mother are so proud because he was on TV.
And that was all driven by him? He just popped over and said, "What can I do to help you?"
Yeah, that was 2 months ago. It was. So I knew the TV one was coming, and I said, "Jack, would you like to come over?" And so we got him in too.
The idea of, I was going to ask you as well actually about your books. Do you know how many languages they're done in?
No, I don't.
But is it everywhere? Is it every corner of the planet?
They send me copies of the translations and lots, and some of fairly remote European languages, and it's funny getting your book and you can't read it. Yeah.
And this one here, the anthology, launched last weekend in New Zealand. Is this going around the world?
Yes.
Yeah. Is it already around the world, or have we got it in New Zealand first?
No, but it's been bought by other. Gecko Press are very good at marketing, and they go to the book fairs and
will you tour on this? Like, is that something you would still do?
To
wherever, if someone in America wanted you to come and talk about your book and something you're still, or you're not interested in that anymore?
No, it's not the lack of interest; it's just a lack of energy. I'm 83, so
yeah.
That.
Can I just say as well?
I'm physically strong, but the eyes are weak.
Yeah.
So writing notes is quite difficult, and finding my way around airports, etc.
See, if I was a professional, Jace, we could have done a proper interview, not just had a bit of a chit chat, and then all around the world could have used our interview about your book. But I'm not a professional and I'm not a proper interviewer. We just chat in this place.
Well, that's what I like about it. It's informal.
The jumbaroo.
The worst thing that can happen to any author is for them to believe they're advertising.
Right. Almost any person, not just any author.
Oh yeah.
Because everyone has advertising, don't they? It may not be official advertising, but everyone has advertising.
Yeah.
This is available in shops now. I think that it's amazing. It's amazing. What's next for Joy Cowley? It feels like you've sort of done everything. It's interesting you also said that you wouldn't classify this as perfection, but in our conversation earlier you did say, what is perfection? You asked me the same question, and why? So if this is not how you classify it, do you have a what is perfection for you answer? Perfection
comes after arrival. It's the end. There's no arrival in this life.
Right.
But, quantum theory has some very interesting statements to make that sort of support this. They say that energy does not disappear from the universe.
Mm-hmm.
If something is destroyed in one place, it will appear in another. Now, how does that sound about reincarnation? And I also remind children too that ever since the beginning of the universe, there has never been another person exactly like them, and there never will be again. That too is true, as far as we know.
It's interesting to think about that. There is also, I was listening to Neil deGrasse Tyson. I always get those wrong way around the other day, and talking about within the universe and parallel universes, how there's a scientific theory of parallel universes doing everything that you can imagine ever doing. So there's a parallel universe where I'm the author and you're interviewing me right now. It's the other way around. And there's a parallel universe where, we're doing this exact same video, but it's a different book of video. Sorry,
And there's a video where we're doing the exact same thing we're doing now, but we're all frogs.
Yeah.
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 Yeah, that's the branching universe theory, and then just the fact that there's infinite possibilities. I remember seeing a great
Infinite
interview.
possibilities,
Yeah.
but we get so caught up on this one little person, and we insulate ourselves and become a prison of one.
Yeah, and that comes back to the isolation thing as well.
That's the isolation.
With that idea of that we're all unique, because I've heard that in the context of I've been to a lot of script writing seminars and so forth, and I often question who am I to tell a story or to tell my story, or surely, especially as a middle class white man, which and there's no shortage of middle class white men that are ready to offer their opinions on things. And so I'm why should I be allowed to tell my story or a story? And then people will just respond by saying, there's nobody like you. There's nobody that's had your life experiences and is going to tell a story like you will tell a story. And so I guess putting that into a kind of a question, what would you say to young authors that are considering, they're going, oh, I think I could write,
First of all, drop any labels.
So don't call yourself an author?
Don't call you. Well, yes, don't do that. Just we've all got stories within us, and don't call yourself a middle class white man. That's a label.
It is a label. That's right. Yeah, and
I know other people use that. Don't you use?
Yeah, and that's the thing as well, is that is people can get caught up in the fact that they think they don't have a story to tell because they are part of a majority. And the thing is that there isn't anybody like, that young 4-year-old or that young 8-year-old who really likes this thing and wants to write about it. And I've had many conversations as well about creativity, and people say, we're not, I'm not a creative person. It's like, well, actually, we're all creative people.
Yeah.
Going into the spiritual thing, like I'm myself, I'm a spiritual person, and we're all created. If you believe the Judeo-Christian sort of Bible and so forth, we're all created in the image of the God, the God figure. And he is a creator. Therefore we are creators. And so everybody, whether you're an engineer, whether you're a film writer, whether you're a podcaster, whether you are a factory worker, we are all creative. So you can't just go, I'm an author, and you're not.
That's right. That's right. No, that's the ego speaking, isn't it? Someone asked me on a recent interview, what's the difference between religion and spirituality? And I said, well, religion is a path we choose, spiritual is what we are. And I think that's true.
Is there an element that religion feels like also the construct around someone's spirituality? Like, I think when I think about religion, I think of the organizations and the buildings and the groups, the foundations, and then spirituality is the people and where they go with it a little bit. I don't know. I mean, like for you, for example, speaking of buildings surrounding you, when you had your spiritual journey and you came to a place where you jumped into a particular boat, you chose Catholicism.
Yeah.
Why Catholicism over anything else?
because it was a journey which doesn't have an end. Other journeys I'd looked at a lot of other churches and other traditions which were outside of my culture, but I'd always had this sort of relationship with Jesus and the Gospels.
Because of your upbringing as well?
Because of my upbringing, and also because I saw human journey in his journey, everything that we might be expected to go through. I'm not a great fan of atonement theology, but that's miserable. But I believe that this being had something special that shows what we can expect of life. And the fact that the crucifixion and resurrection too is very important to me, because what is resurrected is always greater than what has died in our lives.
So what comes back?
So what
comes back is always more important. What is
we
resurrected?
We move, we get rid of something that is very often loss is very painful in our lives.
Right.
But once we've got over, like for me, I've been stuck in the tomb with bitterness and anger and self-pity and all that tripe, and it's just part of the process. And then when I come out of it, I realise that I have been emptied of something that needed to go so I could move to a larger place. It's that larger place always.
Right. And when you say that there was no end within Catholicism, even within the various denominations of the church, how is that different from, for example, a Baptist or a Presbyterian or an Anglican? Why is there no end, as you saw it, within Catholicism, but maybe you saw an end in the other denominations of a similar faith?
Well, probably that was the wrong way to explain it. Again, it's parable. A metaphor. If I compare what I know of the Catholic Church with an education system, it sort of begins at kindergarten and it goes through to PhD and beyond. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So it's a continual learning. The learning never stops.
It goes to the place where words leave off. Right. And the presence is very strong. That presence, that otherness that we always have, call it Allah, some people call it Buddha. But we know it. It's there working in us.
Do you find when you're doing your spiritual direction and holding retreats and stuff, you're getting other religions coming along to it? Do you get Buddhists? Do you get Muslims coming along to them as well?
Yes, I do, and I've had Jewish people coming too. Yeah. Yes, mainly Christian, but they do come because spirituality has no denomination. Right. It's what we are.
Yeah.
And we have. I really believe in this, in the power of parables, and we have when we create our own parables. To explain what is happening in us. Right. There is a Sufi parable which comes from the Islamic tradition, which I like very much. It's very, very simple. It says they always begin their parables about Jesus are parables to explain Jesus' teachings. Jesus is a prophet. And this one says, Jesus, son of Mary, was walking along the road and he saw some people huddled together, shaking with fear. And he said to them, "What is afflicting you?" And one man said, "We are so afraid of going to hell." He went on walking and he came to another group who were lying around. They were not interested in what was happening around them. They were simply lying with a glazed look. And he said, "What is your affliction?" And one of them said, "Oh, we are longing for paradise." And then he came to another lot. They were quite different. They were full of vigor. They looked as though they'd had hard times, but they were very happy. They were cheerful. They were working hard. They were singing. And he said, what made you like this? And they said, we discovered the spirit of truth. And when you have the spirit of truth, nothing else matters. It's a good one, isn't it?
That's a very good one. Hey, before we wrap up, we've got a little bit of time yet. I was going to ask you, do you keep an eye on other young writers, etc., that are coming up? Like, do you spot other Kiwi writers and go, oh, there's one to watch? Do you know of anyone else coming up that you've been impressed with?
There are some very good writers coming up, but I can't read now. This is the difficulty with the failing eyesight. But certainly I can look at the illustrators that I in children's picture books.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a lot of New Zealand books that are being sold overseas now.
And would it be fair to say that you've gone through quite a golden era? I mean, Tessa Duda, Margaret Mahi, yourself, there's a pretty phenomenal period of, especially for children and YA, of writing through, I guess you say, the 70s and 80s especially. It's a pretty special time to be a New Zealand author in that time.
Well, it was a special time because when we started out, Margaret and I both had our first children's books published in other countries, because there wasn't a New Zealand publisher who would do. So there was something very new happening. It wasn't a renaissance of children's books so much as a naissance. It was just happened.
Yeah.
And even when I started, it was thought that people who wrote children's books couldn't write adult material. They'd failed at real writing. Some people used to say to me, when are you going to get back to real writing? And I'd say, this is as real as it gets.
Yeah. And also, I mean, it must be hugely satisfying to think you've been an influence on 2-3 generations of New Zealanders coming through. Must be an amazing thought. Like I said, I mean, my daughter, I think I told you this off air. If I'm repeating myself in an hour, I apologise. But my daughter, who was 15, was jealous that I got to talk to you today. She wanted to come in to the podcast. And the book she went running to look for to get you to sign was Chameleon, Chameleon. I mean, what age group is Chameleon, Chameleon aimed at? Sub 3, 4?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's very
and
simple.
That was the one.
Very simple.
That was the one she went running to look for, to grab. And she was like, oh, where's my Chameleon, Chameleon? And she's 15. It just must be a fascinating time. Your memories of Margaret, is there anything that stands out for those of us who never met her, Margaret Mahi, that you think back fondly of knowing her?
Margaret was a good friend, and she phoned regularly while I phoned her, and we always ended up making up stories on the phone.
Oh yeah.
She was quite ill at the end. Before the cancer, she also had Parkinson's, so she was not steady on her feet. But she was always very cheerful, and she always had jokes. So when she phoned me, and she said, oh, I've just fallen down the stairs, and I was carrying a lemon squeezer, and I've now got the mark of the lemon squeezer on my right buttock, because she'd fallen on it. And I thought she was joking, and no, it wasn't. It was true.
Absolutely.
And she was making a joke out of it.
Wow.
She had a wonderful imagination. Usually writers write and speakers speak. We're not good at both.
Yep.
Margaret was superb at both. And once there was a program called Kaleidoscope. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
Yeah. We were both on it because we both had our first books published in the same year. We were both born in the same year. So they did something with us together at Margaret's place. And at the end of a hilarious weekend, there was much red wine, and Margaret's rabbits were hopping around the floor and trying to chew through all the wiring they had in those days with the filming. And the director said, can one of you say something to wind this up? Now, if you'd given me a pen and a bit of paper and a whole hour, I could have thought of something. But Margaret said instantly, when one embarks on a weekend convivial, it can be serious, it can be trivial.
Just like that.
Just like that.
That's amazing. Have you seen her playground? Her playground in Christchurch. Have you been there?
No, I haven't been there yet.
Amazing.
No,
it's like you think about someone who impacted, the children of the nation so much, and you think perfect, a perfect thing to leave us with.
Oh, yeah.
What about yourself? I mean, I'm not talking about you not being with us, but what do you want to leave? What do you want to be with New Zealand for the next 50, 100, 200 years once you've gone back to where you came from, as we talked about earlier?
I want New Zealand to continue to be the sort of New Zealand we saw in that Christchurch massacre. The way we revealed who we were when that tragedy occurred. I hope that we will always be that nation.
Because we already are. It's just a matter of enacting it, isn't it? Because if we were for that period, then we are.
That's what we are now, and that's what I want to see to continue.
And finally, I wanted to ask you this question. I'm just keeping an eye on your time there. We've been going for an hour and 15 minutes. This is like a little TARDIS in here. The time just flies by. I wanted to ask you about the damehood. Is that the correct terminology?
Damehood, that sounds very funny.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does, actually.
Because do you officially have the title, Dame?
Yes, I do.
Yeah, so Dame Joy Cowley
but
officially.
I said no to using it simply because I don't use... I said before that I really do sort of protect my ordinariness.
Right.
I love the... and especially the ONZ, because that you don't keep the medals for that. You pass them back on, and they go on to the next person.
And that's like
wonderful.
the only 20 of them or something. Is that?
Yeah, that's right. So this is my country's kindness, and it was received with much gratitude. But what I am is what I am, and I'm Joy Cowley, and I don't wear titles of any kind. Interestingly, someone from the Dom Post phoned and said, I hear you're a Republican. And I said, what?
Hang on, pause. Do you mean wanting New Zealand to be a republic, or do you mean supporting what the Republicans in America do?
Apparently there was some movement wanting New Zealand to be a republic.
Okay, gotcha.
Because this was a few years ago.
Yeah.
And they said that you're anti-royal. I said, oh, goodness, no. And then she explained that you're not using the title.
Right.
And
so they made an assumption of your...
They made an assumption that that's what I was. And I said, no, because it would get between me and the children I work with.
So if that's the place you're taking about being... What did you say? Tap water? You used that phrase before or something?
Oh, ordinary as tap water.
Sure.
Yeah.
Why did you accept it at all? Is it more of an acknowledgement of... Because a lot of people say they accepted a knighthood or that kind of... Because it's an acknowledgement of those around them as well, not just of themselves. If you're not going to use it, how did the decision making go to accept it?
Well, what happened if I used it?
Oh, nothing.
Nothing.
No.
I mean, it's not something you use. It's just something that you think is lovely, and you're grateful for this gift from your country.
You might get bumped up to first class if you're travelling internationally, but other than that,
oh goodness, yeah, that would be cheating though.
First class between Wellington and Dunedin. I don't know what that means. Well, that was lovely, and I was wondering about this as well. When I picked you up from the airport, lady came running up to you and when you came through the gate, knew who you were, wanted to thank you for the work you've done. Does that happen a lot at the moment? Do you get people recognising you?
People do. So I just have to be careful what I'm doing when I'm in public. I can't sort of stand around picking my nose or anything like. I just being aware of people around me who are going to come up and say things. So yes, that happens. It's sometimes I get tired of it. I have to admit that. Because sometimes the expectations of the people, this morning it was different.
Yeah.
But sometimes there are expectations that, and then I got an idea they're contacting me for the wrong reason.
Right.
Yeah.
I had I was watching a YouTube clip. It was a bunch of comedy actors sitting around talking about life, and one of the points that one of the comedians made was he hates doing the selfies with people. was actually Jim Carrey. Jim Carrey has become quite a wise, erudite, guru on some levels. And he says he hates doing selfies with people. He says because that stops the world. He says he'd rather stand there and say, tell me about you, and have a little conversation with them. Yeah. Whereas what people are doing is they just want the selfie, and then that gets them credit on Instagram, and he actually really dislikes it. Right. And he'd rather just shake their hand and spend 30 seconds with them.
It's something trivial, and you feel that, this age, I'm really not engrossed with trivia.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, hopefully that doesn't mean we can't take an Instagram shot before you leave.
No.
But on that note, Joy Cowley, honestly, it's been an absolute pleasure. I've been so excited about having you in for weeks. Jace will tell you. It's been amazing.
Pat, I'm just so delighted with the breadth of the discussion. We went all over the place. In fact, we went all over the universe.
That's what we do. And and not that this is why you came. You didn't come for a publicity bump or anything, but it's an amazing looking book. It's got some amazing words in it, working with those amazing images.
Have you got time to read Uncle Andy's singlet?
Shall I try?
Yeah.
My dyslexia might kick in. How long is it?
Oh, you might run out of time.
We got all the time in the world.
I think you had the note.
All right. Shall I read a story to wrap up? This is. Can I just say, not that I'm uncomfortable to do
story
this.
Story time with Uncle Pat.
Story time with Uncle Pat. This is a first. Reading a kid's story. I feel like I need a camera over the shoulder, Jay, so you can see the pictures as well.
Almost.
When I don't like saying I was a teacher, because I was the worst thing to happen to the New Zealand education system. So what I typically say is I worked in primary schools for a couple of years. You get the skill of doing this. You talk to the kids and you hold it like this, which I'm not going to do.
You could, if you held it up in front of Joy's face, you could have it.
Well, look, I'll just read it. All right, Uncle Andy's singlet.
Sorry.
Can you believe that?
It's hard to find good help these
Here
days.
we go. Uncle Andy bought the singlet from an army surplus store. It was the only upper garment Uncle Andy ever wore. It kept him warm on winter's nights and cool in summer heat. A singlet that was long enough to dry his muddy feet. Oh, I will sing of the singlet, cried our Uncle Andy. A good old cotton singlet will always come in handy. Should we show the pictures? We did that one, didn't we? Have a look at the picture there. There's the old singlet. Beautiful. Beautiful. Moving on. The singlet made a useful pouch to carry new laid eggs, or veggies from the garden, or fresh killed mutton legs. Once it tied a gate up where Andy had no wire. It wrapped a leaking water pipe. It beat a bracken fire. Oh, I will sing of the singlet, cried our Uncle Andy. A good old cotton singlet will always come in handy. When Andy went out fishing, he took it off his back, tied a knot in one end, and made a herring sack. At home he had a fry-up of little silver fishes, and then he used the singlet to dry his breakfast dishes. It's delightful. You got a little picture there? Oh, I will sing of the singlet, our Uncle Andy cries, but there's only one small problem. It does attract the flies.
I think that says a lot about New Zealand, actually.
Joy Cowley, it has been an absolute honour. Gobbledygook was released last week, obviously in all good bookstores. Thank you so much for bringing a copy down. My children are going to flip their lid when they see that there's a book being delivered by Joy Cowley, and I'm sure even the 15 they'll be fighting over it tonight. They'll be fighting over who gets to read it. Maybe I can use this to blackmail them into doing some work around the house. I won't do that. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for coming in, Joy Cowley. It's just been amazing. Thank you.
Thanks, Pat.